Well, hello everyone. I'm sitting here in front of a map of Disneyland. Now, this is the 1961 map. It's not an original, it's a replica. But still, it's pretty cool. I love maps and I love Disneyland. The thing I love about this map is that not only does it have what existed in the park at the time, but it also has areas that they were going to develop, that they were going to create. So right about here, that's the New Orleans Square area that they were going to build. And this map is so cool to me also because that's like the last part of development that Walt Disney was actually involved in. New Orleans Square opened up in 1966, but also what happened in 1966 was Walt Disney died. So you have Disneyland. That was this idea of Walt Disney. That was his creation. But then he passed away, and now you had these people that had to continue on with this park. That was an incredibly difficult time because no longer was the big guy who created everything and thought of everything, was he there anymore? He was gone. So they had to figure out what they were going to do. Now the good news is, as we know, they continued building, they continued going on, they continued on with that dream. They faced a difficult time, but they kept on going. I think we all like those kind of stories that are stories of difficulty, but people getting through the difficulty. But we're not going to just talk about getting through difficulty tonight. What we're going to talk about tonight is how, even in the midst of difficulty, God wants to move us further on. So we're going to look tonight at Philippians chapter 1. We're going to do verses 12 through 18. So starting in verse 12. Paul says, "I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me really served to advance the gospel." Remember, he is in prison in Rome, awaiting a trial. Now, what happened to get there, he was preaching the gospel in Jerusalem, and then he was arrested. And he actually spent a couple years in prison there, and then finally he appeals to Caesar. He's a Roman citizen, so he can do that. He appeals to Caesar, and now he goes to Rome. But even on the way to Rome, he's shipwrecked. And then he spends 3 months on an island. And then he still has to go to Rome for this trial, and now he's under house arrest. So all this difficulty, he just kind of sums it up, and he says, what has happened to me? And he says, I want you to know that what's happened to me has actually been for good. You might look at all that like, wait a minute, you're talking about being arrested, being in jail, being shipwrecked, now in house arrest. How is that good? Well, the crazy thing is Paul actually wanted to go to Rome. For a long time, this was his goal. Now, sure, he'd rather go as a preacher rather than a prisoner, but his goal was to go there because he knew if he could get to Rome, to the heart of the Roman Empire, to the heart of the known world at the time, and start preaching the gospel there, it could spread all over. So that was his goal, and he made it. Not exactly how he wanted to make it, but he made it. So he's saying this is actually good for the advance of the gospel. There's a verse you probably heard before, Romans 8:28. It says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." It doesn't mean that everything will always be good. Sometimes people mistake that verse to say like, hey, if I become a Christian, that means life will always just be great. It's not what that verse says. It will not always be good. It will not always be our version of good, our definition of good. But even in the midst of hard times, God can bring something good out of that. That's what Paul's talking about. It kind of reminds me like of those cooking shows, like, Iron Chef or Chopped or any of those things. I don't know if you've ever seen those or not, but basically there's a few chefs who are competing and they compete to make different dishes, but there's always a little curveball thrown in. They'll open up like a basket and say, okay, you have to use the ingredients that are in here. And like there'll be something crazy in there, like, I don't know, cactus or something. And it's like, how are they going to use that to make anything that tastes good? But then what often happens on these shows is like that becomes the star of the dish. It's like, wow, without this cactus in there, it wouldn't have been so amazing and delicious. Like they take something, an expert can take something and make it into something really good. Even something that I wouldn't know what to do with. And the same is true of our difficulties. When I go through a difficult time, I don't know what to do with that. But God is the expert. He knows what to do. And he can make something out of that we look back and say, wow, look at that. That's what we're talking about here. See, the first thing we need to understand is that difficulty gives us a chance to see God at work. When things are going great, we might not notice as much. When everything's kind of just feeling perfect, we might not really be looking for God at work. Sure, he's still at work, but we just might not see it. But in those times of difficulty, we can see that God's doing something that helps to open up our eyes. Look now at verses 13 and 14. Paul says there, "So that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard, and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So Paul's saying, look, this has actually been a good thing. And here, let me show you some ways that it's been a good thing. This elite imperial guard, these Roman soldiers that are guarding Paul, they're hearing about Jesus. See, the way it would work back then, like I mentioned before, Paul had to pay for these soldiers to be there, but these were like the elite guards. These were Roman soldiers that he probably wouldn't have had access to any other way. And there would be always one who would be chained to Paul, like handcuffed wrist to wrist. Now, the funny thing about that is there would be several throughout a day. So there'd be maybe 4 to 6 that would come throughout one day. And you can just kind of picture Paul sitting there and the guards change and he gets chained to this new guard. The guard sits down and Paul just kind of has a smile come across his face. He's like, all right, let me tell you about this guy named Jesus. Paul had a very captive audience with this soldier who was chained to him. And so every day he probably knew that he was going to hear about Jesus. And Paul had several chances, several captive members that he got to tell the gospel of Jesus Christ. And some of them believed. And then some of them would go and they'd tell their family. They would tell others, and the gospel spread. And Paul's saying that would have happened if I was not a prisoner here. Now, difficulties will come. They're going to come for you. They're going to come for me. But we have a choice in the midst of that. We can either complain about what God won't do, that he won't do what we want, or we can try to see what he's doing in that difficulty. Paul also says another good thing that's happened is that other believers are getting more bold. They're seeing what's happened to Paul, and they're actually getting more bold because of what's happened to him. You see, sometimes what's in our head is actually scarier than what reality could be. We could think about what if this happens? What if that happens? And that can actually be a scarier thing than what could really happen. You could picture Christians back in this time were probably thinking man, what if we get arrested? What would we do? And then Paul goes and gets arrested, and they're like, oh, well, he seems all right. Okay, not that bad. So it allowed them to become more bold. Growing up, my buddies and me, we had this joke that, say, for example, if we're out hiking in the woods or something, and if one of us got attacked by a bear, we would look at the other ones and we would tell them, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. Because, they're going to get attacked by a bear too, but at least they'd think before that happens, at least they'd be thinking, well, I guess it's not that bad though. There's something about knowing something's not as bad as you think it is that helps you face it. Once you see the worst case scenario, it makes it easier to move on. It's okay, that's the worst that could happen, and he survived it? Okay, well, I could survive it. And that's what Paul's saying here. When others saw Paul not only get arrested, but continue to carry on, continue to preach the gospel, it helped them to be more bold. It helped them to want to preach the gospel. This is the thing we have to understand. Encouragement is contagious, but also so is discouragement. If Paul was just always being down and always being sad, then that would have spread to others. They would have been like, man, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to get caught. I don't want this to happen. But instead, he was still bold. He was still preaching the gospel. He was still excited about it. Think about it. How many times in your day have you just gone through life and then a great day gets sidelined by someone being negative? It happens, right? And on the opposite end, how many times have you had a really bad day that gets lifted up by someone being encouraging? That happens too. Which of those two things would you rather do? We can choose to be encouraging, or we can just be discouraging. It's all about how we face things. It's all about perspective. Paul was in chains. That was his difficulty. Now, we face difficulties too. We have chains, so to speak. And they might not be as extreme as Paul's, but God used Paul's chains. God can use our chains. God can use our difficulties too. We have to just be on the lookout. Look at verse 15 now. Paul says there, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. So he says, look, there's a lot of believers who are getting more bold about what they're saying. And some are preaching the gospel, but they're actually preaching it with the wrong motives, which is interesting. He's not saying that they're false teachers. They're not teaching anything that's not true. They're preaching the true gospel, yet they're doing it out of envy or out of rivalry. The second thing we have to understand is that difficulty gives us a chance to see our true motives. You can do the right thing for wrong reasons. That's what he's saying. There were some who were preaching the gospel, but were doing it for a wrong reason. Remember that God cares about what you do, but God also cares about why you're doing it. Just to prove this, think about a group called the Pharisees. Remember them? They pretty much did all the right things, but Jesus did not really approve of what they were doing. because they weren't doing it for the right reason. Their motive was more about looking good to others. Their motive was about bringing glory to themselves. He says that's your only reward you're going to get because you're not doing it for the right reason. So we have to not only do the right thing, but we need to be sure that we're doing it for the right reason. You can fool people in your small group. You can fool people at church. You can fool your parents, your friends. You can fool me. You can't fool God. He knows why you're really doing those things. Difficulty can help us make sure we're doing things for the right reason. Look at verse 16. He says, the latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. So he's saying, look, there's this group who are preaching the gospel for good reasons. They're doing so out of love. And love is so cool because love is unifying. It unites. It brings people together. 1 Peter 4:8 says, above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. See, I may not always agree with you, but if I love you, that'll be okay. Love allows us to have some room for disagreement, allows us to have some room to not see everything eye to eye. That's what love can do. It covers up over all that. John 13:35, Jesus says, by this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Jesus says love should be the thing that people should look and say, hey, those must be followers of Jesus because of how they love. Christians are meant to be marked by love. And sometimes we think this is an optional thing, but it's not. Jesus also said in John 14:15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. If we love Jesus, we'll do what he says. What has he told us to do? To love God and to love each other. That's what we need to do. And if we do that, we will find that we are more united than divided. Love, it's a huge thing. But look at verse 17. He says the former, so those ones who do it out of envy and rivalry, the former proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. So love always brings unity, but envy always brings strife. It always brings fighting. That's what it does. Because the focus of love is others. The focus of envy is yourself. If you're envious of someone, it's because you're focusing on yourself. That's what was happening here. So even while in chains, Paul still wanted to bring glory to the name of Jesus. And some looked at his imprisonment and what they thought was, hey, here's my chance. This big guy, this big dog, this big preacher, he's sidelined. So now I can rise up. I can get more glory. That's what they wanted. Some saw it as an opportunity. I remember the first time I taught something, and a little bit later, someone else took something that I said, and they said it as well. And then afterwards, people were like, wow, did you hear what he said? That was such a great point, wasn't it? And I'm thinking like, yeah, it was. I said it. I remember at that moment, it was a great chance for me to check my own motives, to say, do I care more about my glory or God's glory? And now, honestly, I mean, I use other people's stuff all the time. It's just what you do. If there's a great point, it's like, man, I'm going to share that with someone else too. And I hope people will take what I say and share it with other people. But like I said, at that moment, it was a chance for me to check and see, what do I really care about? God's glory or my glory? In verse 18, Paul goes on. He says, what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. And in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. Basically what he's saying there is like, you know what? What does it matter? What does it matter? The thing that matters is the gospel is getting preached. And since that's happening, I'm happy. I'll rejoice. Our third and final point is that difficulty gives us a chance to see what really matters. Even with the wrong motives, the gospel was being preached. So Paul says, yeah, I get it. You know what? I don't really agree with the motive behind what they're doing, but the gospel's getting out there. That's what I care about. So Paul was able to rejoice in his difficulty, not just because he was through it, because he was still in prison. He was still in the midst of that difficult season. And in the midst of it, he could still rejoice. We don't want to just wait to rejoice and celebrate God after he gets us through something, but even in the midst of a difficulty. What it comes down to is, where's your focus? God is at work in your life. God will be at work in your life. Right now, though, where's your focus? Are you even looking for God's hand? Or are you just focused on whatever difficulty you might be facing? We can find lots of things to focus on. But what we focus on affects how we live. What we focus on affects how we behave, how we act. It affects our entire lives. See, the thing about a focal point, the definition of a focal point, is that it is the center of activity or attention. The center. You can only have one focal point, only one center. You can't focus on a bunch of things at once. That's not what focus means. Focus means you center on one thing. Where is your focus? What are you focused on? You know, when Walt Disney died, they could have just focused on that sad, difficult time. They could have given up. They could have stopped. Or they could have focused on what his dream was. To build a place for families to come, to build something bigger and better. So that's what they focused on. They kept building, they kept going forward. And that's just a theme park. I mean, really in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter that much. What about your life? Let's make it personal for a second here. What difficulty are you facing? What difficulty have you just faced? What difficulty are you about to face? Or let's just make it general for everyone. We're all facing the same difficulty. In what sense? COVID. You know, COVID is not great. It's a difficulty. It is a genuine difficulty, and it's rough. But even with that, where's your focus? Is it just to get through it to the other side, and at that point we'll praise God? Or what about praising Him right now in the midst of this difficult time? What about what is He doing right now in this difficulty? Are you more focused just on your crummy circumstances, or are you focused on what God is doing? Can you see God at work? What has God done in your life in this difficult season? God does want to take you further on in your faith, and He wants to do that even during the difficult times. I hope now as you guys discuss this, whatever difficulty you might be facing, always keep in mind that you're not alone. There's friends, there's your small group, there's family, there's pastors, there's people you can talk to. You never have to face difficult times alone. And ultimately, God always goes with you through difficult seasons. And in the midst of a difficult season, He's with you. He's working on you. He wants you to grow. And He never, ever leaves us. So we know no matter what we face, we don't face it alone. And that should bring us tremendous hope.